In 1945, when the last bombs fell and the smoke finally cleared across Europe and the Pacific, something remarkable began to happen on American soil. Not a military campaign, not a political revolution, something quieter and, in many ways, far more consequential. An entire class of people, tens of millions of them, began to rise. Factory workers who had never owned a home suddenly held the keys to one. Sons of sharecroppers and immigrant laborers walked onto college campuses for the first time in their family's history. A generation that had known nothing but depression and war was suddenly buying cars, filling refrigerators, and raising children in suburban neighborhoods that hadn't existed 5 years earlier. This was the birth of the American middle class as we know it. And for about 3 decades, it was the most powerful economic engine the world had ever seen. Not just powerful for the people living it, but powerful for the entire global order. A strong American middle class funded highways, fueled innovation, built the space program, and underwrote the longest sustained period of broadly shared prosperity in modern history. And then, slowly at first, and then with a grinding inevitability that most people only recognized in hindsight, that engine started to sputter. The paychecks stopped growing. The houses got harder to afford. The college degrees that once guaranteed a comfortable life started requiring decades of debt. And the factory jobs, the backbone of it all, began vanishing overseas or into the circuits of machines. Today, when economists and politicians talk about the American middle class, they're not describing a thriving majority. They're describing a shrinking minority. According to the Pew Research Center, the share of American adults living in middle-income households dropped from 61% in 1971 to roughly 50% by 2021. That's not a minor fluctuation. That's an entire demographic category being hollowed out over the span of a single lifetime. So the question isn't whether the middle class is disappearing. The data is overwhelming on that front. The real question, the one worth spending the next hour unraveling, is why? What forces, what decisions, what structural shifts turn the most prosperous middle class in human history into something that millions of Americans can no longer afford to belong to? And more importantly, who benefited from its erosion? To understand the answer, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand exactly how the middle class was built. Because the truth is, it didn't happen by accident. It was constructed brick by brick, policy by policy, in the aftermath of the deadliest conflict in human history. And the blueprint that built it also contained, buried deep in its foundations, the very cracks that would eventually tear it apart. Let's start in the summer of 1945. The war is over, and America is standing in a position that no nation in human history has ever occupied before or since. The country is responsible for roughly half of the entire world's economic output while holding only about 5% of its population. Every other industrial power on Earth, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, is either bombed into rubble or financially exhausted. America's factories, its cities, its infrastructure, all of it is intact. Not a single bomb had fallen on the continental United States. But here's the part that most people gloss over. It wasn't just that America was untouched. It was that America had been transformed. Before the war, the United States was still recovering from the Great Depression. Unemployment had hovered near 25% in the early 1930s. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Banks had collapsed by the thousands. The New Deal had helped, but it hadn't fully cured the underlying sickness. What cured it was the war economy. Between 1941 and 1945, the federal government essentially took command of the American industrial apparatus. Automobile factories were retooled to build tanks and aircraft. Textile mills churned out military uniforms. Shipyards launched vessels at a pace the world had never imagined possible. Unemployment didn't just fall, it effectively vanished. Wages rose because labor was in such high demand. And because there was almost nothing to buy during wartime, because consumer goods were rationed, workers saved enormous amounts of money. They bought war bonds. They stuffed cash into savings accounts. By the time the war ended, American households were sitting on a mountain of pent-up demand and the savings to back it up. Now here's where the government made a decision that would define the next half-century of American life. On June 22, 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act into law. You know it better as the GI Bill. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the single most transformative pieces of legislation in the history of the modern world. The GI Bill did 3 things that fundamentally rewired American society. First, it paid for college. Roughly 8 million returning veterans took advantage of the education benefits. Universities that had been small, exclusive institutions were suddenly flooded with students. The University of Syracuse, for example, tripled its enrollment almost overnight. Higher education, once the exclusive province of the wealthy, became a middle-class expectation within a single generation. It doubled the country's higher education enrollment in just 5 years. Second, the GI Bill offered low-interest home loans. This, combined with the Federal Housing Administration's mortgage insurance program, made homeownership possible for millions of families who had never dreamed of owning property. Before the war, homeownership was a minority experience in America. Within a decade after the war, it became the norm. Developers like William Levitt pioneered mass production techniques for housing, building entire neighborhoods of modest, affordable homes at record speed. These Levitt towns became the blueprint for the American suburb. And third, the bill provided unemployment insurance and small business startup capital for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. Less than 20% of the money set aside for unemployment benefits was actually distributed, not because the program failed, but because jobs were so plentiful that most veterans didn't need it. The result was an economic explosion unlike anything the world had seen. New car sales quadrupled between 1945 and 1955. By the end of the 1950s, roughly 75% of American households owned at least one car. In 1965, the automobile industry hit its absolute peak, producing over 11 million new vehicles and accounting for 1 out of every 6 jobs in the country. The highway system expanded massively after the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, which authorized the construction of over 41,000 miles of interstate highways. This wasn't just infrastructure, it was the circulatory system of a new economy, connecting suburbs to cities, factories to ports, and consumers to shopping centers. The baby boom amplified everything. From 1946 to 1964, the American birth rate effectively doubled. The population grew at nearly 2% per year. More babies meant more houses, more schools, more consumer goods, more everything. The economy didn't just grow, it compounded. And here's the crucial detail. The growth wasn't just happening at the top. It was happening everywhere. Between 1945 and 1973, real wages for ordinary workers rose in lockstep with productivity. When the economy grew, workers got their share of that growth. The median family income roughly doubled during this period in real inflation-adjusted terms. A single factory worker could support a family of 4, own a home, take vacations, and put money away for retirement. That wasn't a fantasy. That was the statistical norm. Unions were a massive part of why this worked. At their peak in the mid-1950s, about 33.5% of the American workforce was unionized. 1 in 3 workers carried a union card. And unions didn't just negotiate wages for their own members. They set wage standards across entire industries. When General Motors agreed to a contract with the United Auto Workers, non-union companies in the same sector had to raise their wages too, or risk losing their best workers. Unions compressed wages, pushing up the bottom and restraining the top. The 1940s in particular were what economists Claudia Golden and Robert Margo called a decade of extraordinary wage compression. The gap between the highest paid and lowest paid workers shrank dramatically. The tax code reinforced this compression. During the 1950s, under President Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, the top marginal income tax rate sat at 91%. Now, almost nobody actually paid that rate on all their income. That's not how marginal rates work, but it meant that there was an effective ceiling on how much wealth any individual could accumulate in a given year. The incentive structure pushed corporate profits back into the business, into wages, into expansion, into research and development, rather than into the pockets of executives and shareholders. And the government itself was spending. Federal expenditure as a share of the economy remained substantial throughout the post-war period. Defense spending during the Cold War kept factories running and engineers employed. The Korean War in the early 1950s provided another boost. And Eisenhower's highway program was the largest public works project in American history at that point. Per capita income in the United States was roughly $1,450, almost twice that of Great Britain. The average urban American consumed about 3,000 calories per day, nearly 50% more than their counterparts in Western Europe. This was the golden age, and if you grew up in it, or if your parents did, it felt permanent. It felt like the natural order of things, the idea that an ordinary person could work hard, play by the rules, and achieve a comfortable, secure, dignified life. That wasn't idealism. That was lived reality for a huge swath of the American population. But it wasn't permanent. And the cracks were already forming, even during the best years, in ways that most people couldn't see. The first crack was exclusion. The golden age was not golden for everyone. The GI Bill, for all its transformative power, was administered largely through state and local agencies. In the South, this meant that black veterans were systematically denied the same benefits that white veterans received. Black veterans were steered away from 4-year universities and into vocational programs, and they were denied home loans in white neighborhoods through a practice called redlining, where the Federal Housing Administration literally drew red lines on maps around black communities and labeled them too risky for mortgage insurance. The suburbs that the GI Bill and FHA loans built were, by design, overwhelmingly white. Levittown, the original model suburb, explicitly barred black families from purchasing homes through restrictive covenants in its property deeds. This meant that the wealth-building engine of the post-war era, home ownership, was effectively whites only for its first critical decades. And because home equity was the primary vehicle through which middle-class families accumulated wealth, this exclusion had compounding effects across generations. The racial wealth gap that exists today didn't materialize out of thin air. It was engineered, in part, by the very policies that built the white middle class. The second crack was structural. The post-war boom depended on a unique set of global conditions that couldn't last forever. America's dominance in manufacturing was partly a function of the fact that every other industrial nation had been bombed flat. As Europe and Japan rebuilt, often with American aid through programs like the Marshall Plan, they became competitors again. By the late 1960s, German and Japanese manufacturers were producing automobiles, steel and electronics that rivaled or exceeded American quality, often at lower cost. The American share of global manufacturing began to shrink, not because America got worse, but because everyone else got better. And the third crack was ideological. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, a new economic philosophy was gaining traction in academic circles and in the corridors of corporate power. It held that the post-war consensus, high taxes, strong unions, heavy regulation, government spending, was actually holding the economy back. That the real engine of growth wasn't shared prosperity, but individual entrepreneurship, unfettered markets, and capital accumulation at the top. This philosophy didn't have a name yet, but it would soon be called supply-side economics. And its most famous evangelist would be a former actor from California. Before we get to Reagan, though, we have to talk about what happened in 1971. Because in many ways, that year marks the precise moment when the post-war middle-class bargain began to unravel. On August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on live television and announced what he called the new economic policy. He identified three goals: create more and better jobs, stop the rise in the cost of living, and protect the dollar from international money speculators. To achieve the first two, he proposed tax cuts and a 90-day freeze on wages and prices. To achieve the third, he did something that would reshape the entire global financial system. He suspended the convertibility of the United States dollar into gold. This is what economists call the Nixon shock, and its consequences are still reverberating today. Since the end of World War II, the international monetary system had operated under the Bretton Woods Agreement. 44 countries had agreed that their currencies would be fixed to the US dollar, and the dollar, in turn, would be fixed to gold at $35 per ounce. The system provided stability and predictability. It also imposed discipline. The United States couldn't simply print unlimited amounts of money because every dollar in circulation was theoretically backed by a corresponding amount of gold sitting in Fort Knox. But by the late 1960s, the system was under severe strain. The cost of the Vietnam War and President Lyndon Johnson's ambitious Great Society programs had created massive budget deficits. The government was spending far more than it was taking in. To finance the gap, the Federal Reserve essentially created more dollars. But as the supply of dollars grew, foreign governments began to worry that there wasn't enough gold to back them all. France, under Charles de Gaulle, started converting its dollar reserves into gold and shipping it home. Other countries followed. Gold was flowing out of the United States at an alarming rate. Nixon's advisors, including Treasury Secretary John Connally and a young Paul Volcker, convinced him that the only way to stop the hemorrhaging was to break the link between the dollar and gold entirely. And so he did. In a single television address, Nixon effectively ended the monetary system that had underpinned the entire post-war economic order. The immediate effects were dramatic. The stock market jumped 4% the next day. But the medium-term consequences were devastating. Without the gold anchor, the dollar began to float freely on international markets. Its value fluctuated, and crucially, it began to lose purchasing power much more rapidly than before. Inflation, which had been relatively manageable throughout the post-war period, began to climb. By 1973, it was made worse by the OPEC oil embargo, which quadrupled the price of petroleum virtually overnight. The American economy entered a nightmarish condition that economists hadn't believed was possible. Stagflation, the combination of high inflation, high unemployment, and stagnant economic growth, all happening at the same time. For the middle class, stagflation was corrosive. Wages weren't keeping up with rising prices. Savings lost value in real terms. The cost of gasoline, heating oil, and basic necessities surged. Interest rates climbed into double digits. And for the first time since the end of the war, the American worker began to feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. This is also the moment when something remarkable happened in the relationship between productivity and wages. From 1945 to roughly 1973, productivity and hourly compensation had risen together, almost in perfect parallel. When the economy got more productive, workers got paid more. Full stop. But after 1973, the lines diverged. Productivity kept climbing, eventually soaring by about 81% between 1979 and 2024. But hourly pay for typical workers grew by only 29.4% over that same period. The gap between what workers produced and what they were paid widened into a chasm. And the difference, the enormous surplus of value that workers created but didn't receive, flowed upward. It went to corporate profits, to executive compensation, to shareholders, to the financial sector. This is the single most important chart in American economic history, and most people have never seen it. The divergence between productivity and pay is not a natural phenomenon. It is the result of specific decisions made by specific people in specific institutions over the course of decades. And the first, and arguably most consequential of those decisions, was the deliberate destruction of organized labor. Remember, at their peak in the mid-1950s, unions represented about a third of the American workforce. That number had already started to decline by the early 1970s, down to about 30% of American households. But the real collapse came in the 1980s. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House in January of 1981, approximately 20% of private sector workers were unionized. By the time he left office in 1989, that number had fallen to 12%. Today, it sits near 6% in the private sector. Reagan set the tone early. In August of 1981, when the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization went on strike, Reagan didn't negotiate. He fired all 11,000 plus striking workers. It was technically legal, they were federal employees, and their strike violated their oath. But the symbolism was unmistakable. The most powerful man in the world had just declared that organized labor was the enemy, and corporate America took notice. Over the next decade, employers became far more aggressive in opposing unionization efforts, hiring anti-union consultants, threatening plant closures, and replacing strikers permanently, all tactics that were technically within the law but had been considered unacceptable in the post-war era. The decline of unions didn't just reduce the bargaining power of union members. It removed the countervailing force that had kept wages rising for everyone. Without the threat of unionization, non-union employers had no reason to share productivity gains with their workers. Without collective bargaining, individual workers had almost no leverage against their employers. The labor market became, for all practical purposes, a buyer's market, and the buyers were corporations. Simultaneously, Reagan embarked on the most ambitious overhaul of the tax code since the post-war era. The Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 slashed the top marginal income tax rate from 70% to 50%. A subsequent reform in 1986 dropped it further to 28%. Capital gains taxes were cut. Corporate taxes were reduced. The theory, championed by economist Arthur Laffer and popularized by Reagan, was that cutting taxes at the top would stimulate so much investment and growth that the benefits would trickle down to ordinary workers. More investment would mean more factories, more jobs, more opportunity for everyone. The theory was elegant. The reality was something else entirely. The economy did grow during the 1980s, particularly after the brutal recession of 1982. Around 20 million jobs were created over the decade. Unemployment fell from 7.6% to 5.5%. But the growth was uneven in ways that the trickle-down model hadn't predicted, or at least hadn't advertised. The benefits concentrated overwhelmingly at the top of the income distribution. In tax year 1985, the top 1% received a windfall of roughly $350,000 from the tax changes in today's dollars. The typical household received about $3,500, and the poorest Americans received a few hundred. Meanwhile, deregulation opened the floodgates. Financial markets were deregulated, allowing banks and investment firms to take on more risk and create more complex financial instruments. This drove a boom in Wall Street profits, but it also planted the seeds of the savings and loan crisis of the late 1980s, which ultimately cost taxpayers roughly $130 billion. The airline industry was deregulated. The telecommunications industry was deregulated. In each case, the promise was more competition and lower prices. Sometimes that happened. But often, deregulation led to consolidation, as larger firms swallowed smaller ones, reducing competition and concentrating market power. The combined effect of tax cuts, deregulation, and the weakening of unions was a massive upward redistribution of income and wealth. The share of total income going to the top 1%, which had been relatively stable throughout the post-war era, began to climb sharply in the early 1980s. By 1989, it had already surged noticeably, and it would continue climbing for the next 3 decades. Then came globalization. In the 1990s, under President Bill Clinton, the United States embraced free trade with an enthusiasm that had no historical precedent. The North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect in 1994, creating a free trade zone between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. In 2000, Congress granted China permanent normal trade relations, paving the way for China's entry into the World Trade Organization the following year. The theory behind free trade was, again, elegant. If countries specialize in what they do best and trade freely with each other, everyone benefits. American consumers would get cheaper goods. American companies would access larger markets, and developing countries would grow their economies, creating new customers for American products. The overall pie would grow, and everyone would get a bigger slice. What actually happened was more complicated and, for millions of American workers, catastrophic. Between the late 1990s and the early 2000s, an estimated 2.4 million American jobs were lost to Chinese competition alone, according to research by economists David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson. The manufacturing sector, which had been the backbone of the middle class since the post-war era, was gutted. In 1950, roughly a third of American workers were employed in manufacturing. By 2019, that number had fallen to about 8%. The jobs that replaced them were overwhelmingly in the service sector: retail, hospitality, food service, healthcare, jobs that paid less, offered fewer benefits, provided less security, and were far less likely to be unionized. Entire communities were devastated. Factory towns across the Midwest and the South, places that had thrived for generations on a single industry, were hollowed out almost overnight. The so-called Rust Belt wasn't just an economic phenomenon, it was a social catastrophe. As factories closed, tax revenues fell, schools deteriorated, infrastructure crumbled, drug addiction surged. Life expectancy in some of these communities actually began to decline, a phenomenon that economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton would later document as deaths of despair, deaths from suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholism among middle-aged white Americans without college degrees. And then came 2008. The financial crisis of 2008 was the culmination of decades of deregulation, reckless lending, and financial engineering. In the years leading up to the crash, banks had been issuing mortgages to borrowers who had little ability to repay them, so-called subprime loans. These mortgages were then packaged into complex securities and sold to investors around the world. Rating agencies, in a spectacular failure of oversight, stamped these toxic products with AAA ratings. And when the housing bubble finally burst, the entire edifice came crashing down. Home values fell roughly 30% in real terms between 2007 and 2009, continuing to decline through 2012. Over $6 trillion in accumulated housing wealth was erased. 12 million homeowners found themselves underwater, owing more on their mortgages than their homes were worth. U.S. stock indexes lost half their value. Consumer spending plunged. In total, American household net worth dropped by roughly $16 trillion, falling from $67.4 trillion in the third quarter of 2007 to $51.4 trillion by early 2009. That represented the same level of household wealth, adjusted for inflation, as 10 years earlier. A full decade of wealth accumulation wiped out in 18 months. Now here's what made the 2008 crisis particularly devastating for the middle class, and particularly revealing about the structural changes that had taken place since the Golden Age. The great misnomer of the 2008 crisis, as some economists have argued, is that it was not primarily a subprime crisis. It was a middle-class crisis. The increase in household debt that preceded the crash was widespread among the population. It encompassed all income groups, but especially middle-class borrowers. And the response to the crisis made everything worse. The federal government stepped in with massive bailouts for the financial sector. The $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, purchased toxic assets from banks that were on the verge of collapse. The Federal Reserve pumped trillions of dollars into the financial system through a process called quantitative easing, buying up bonds and mortgage-backed securities to keep interest rates low and credit flowing. The banks were saved. The stock market recovered. By 2013, the major indexes had surpassed their pre-crisis highs. But for ordinary homeowners, for the 12 million families who were underwater on their mortgages, no comparable bailout ever materialized. While housing made up roughly two-thirds of all middle-class wealth, it represented a much smaller share of wealth for the richest Americans, whose portfolios were dominated by stocks and other financial assets. So the recovery, such as it was, flowed disproportionately to those who held financial assets, meaning the wealthy, and while the middle class was left to claw its way back from the wreckage. The 2008 crisis accelerated every negative trend that had been building for decades. Wealth inequality widened further. Home ownership rates fell. Student debt exploded as young people, unable to find jobs in a devastated economy, stayed in school longer, borrowing ever larger sums to finance degrees that were supposed to be their ticket to the middle class. Total outstanding student loan debt in the United States surpassed $1.7 trillion, a burden carried disproportionately by millennials and Generation Z, the very cohorts who were supposed to be building the next middle class. And the housing market, the traditional engine of middle-class wealth accumulation, became increasingly inaccessible. Median home prices, fueled by low interest rates, investor purchases, and constrained supply, soared far beyond what median incomes could support. In many major metropolitan areas, home ownership became a mathematical impossibility for families earning the median income. The average premium for family health coverage reached over $25,000 by 2024, a 20% increase in just 4 years. Deductibles, the amount families must pay out of pocket before insurance even kicks in, more than doubled since 2009. Healthcare costs now consume roughly 8% of a typical household's budget and push an estimated 5 million people into poverty each year. Medical debt has become a leading cause of personal bankruptcy, even among families with health insurance. And that's the dark irony of it all. These aren't families who refused to work, or who made reckless decisions, or who failed to play by the rules. These are families who did everything they were told to do. They got the education, they found the jobs, they bought the insurance, and they're still drowning. Now there's one more force that deserves attention, because it's often discussed as if it's a natural law, when in fact it's anything but. And that force is technology. Automation and artificial intelligence have been transforming the labor market for decades. Robots replaced assembly line workers in the 1980s and 1990s. Computer algorithms replaced clerical workers and bookkeepers. Self-checkout kiosks replaced cashiers. And now, large language models and advanced AI systems are beginning to encroach on white-collar professions that were once considered automation-proof: legal research, financial analysis, medical diagnostics, software development, content creation. The standard economic argument is that technology destroys some jobs but creates others. And historically, this has been true. The automobile put stable hands out of work but created millions of jobs in manufacturing, sales, repair, and infrastructure. But the new wave of automation is different in a crucial way. The jobs it's destroying are increasingly middle-skill, middle-income jobs, the exact jobs that formed the foundation of the middle class. And the jobs it's creating tend to cluster at the extremes: high-skill, high-pay positions for those with advanced technical education, and low-skill, low-pay positions in services that can't easily be automated, like food preparation, elder care, and delivery. The result is what economists call labor market polarization, a hollowing out of the middle. The well-paying, stable, benefits-providing jobs that sustain generations of middle-class families are being replaced by a barbell economy, where you're either doing very well or barely getting by. So where does all of this leave us? Consider the full picture. In 1971, 61% of American adults lived in middle-income households. By 2021, that figure had fallen to around 50%. Some of that decline was driven by people moving up into higher income brackets, and that's genuinely good news, worth acknowledging. But a significant portion was driven by people falling down. And even for those who technically remain in the middle, the experience of middle-class life has been fundamentally transformed. The costs of the three things that defined middle-class security, housing, healthcare, and education have all risen far faster than incomes. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, have barely budged for the median worker in half a century. And the safety nets that once caught people when they stumbled, strong unions, employer-provided pensions, affordable public universities, have all been weakened or dismantled. Between 1979 and 2023, real earnings for the top 0.1% grew by 354%, from roughly $618,000 to about $2.8 million. For the bottom 90%, earnings grew by just 44% over that same 44-year period, from roughly $30,000 to $43,000. The share of total income flowing to the combined upper middle class and wealthy surged from 28% in 1979 to 68% by 2024. The top 1% alone doubled their share from 5 to 9%, and even that's likely an undercount, because the wealthiest Americans tend not to participate in the census surveys that produce these numbers. Research based on tax data suggests the real figure is closer to 17%. Credit card debt, auto loans, and personal borrowing have all surged as middle-class families use debt to maintain a standard of living that their wages can no longer support. The growth in consumer debt has allowed families to sustain consumption levels despite income stagnation, but it has also made them enormously fragile. Any economic shock, a job loss, a medical emergency, a recession, can push a debt-laden family over the edge. This is the central tragedy of the American middle class. It was built by a specific set of conditions and policies. Massive public investment, strong labor protections, a tax code that constrained inequality, a regulatory framework that prevented financial speculation from destabilizing the real economy, and a global environment in which America had no serious industrial competitors. Over the past 50 years, every single one of those conditions has been weakened, reversed, or eliminated. The public investment dried up. Infrastructure spending fell as a share of GDP. The tax code was rewritten to benefit those at the top. Labor protections were gutted. Financial regulation was dismantled. And globalization, while enriching many at the top and bottom of the global income distribution, devastated the American manufacturing base that had been the middle class's primary employer. None of this was inevitable. None of it was ordained by the laws of economics or the march of technology. These were choices. They were made by elected officials, by corporate executives, by lobbyists, by voters, by all of us, in some form or another. The Golden Age wasn't a gift from the universe. It was something that was built. And the question now is whether anything like it can be built again. Because the consequences of failing to do so are not merely economic. A society where the middle class is shrinking is a society where social mobility declines, where trust in institutions erodes, where political extremism flourishes, and where the basic social contract, the idea that hard work and fair play should lead to a decent life, loses its credibility. You can already see this playing out in the political landscape, where frustration with the economy has become the dominant force in elections, where voters are increasingly drawn to candidates who promise to burn the system down, because the system as it exists has failed them. The story of the American middle class is, in many ways, the story of America itself. Its rise and fall tracks with the nation's greatest achievements and its deepest failures. And understanding how we got here, understanding the specific decisions and forces that built and then dismantled the most broadly prosperous society in modern history, is not just an academic exercise. It's the first step toward figuring out what comes next. If this story resonated with you, if it helped you see the forces behind the headlines, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We go deep on these kinds of stories, the ones that mainstream media either oversimplifies or ignores entirely, because understanding the machinery behind the economy isn't optional anymore. It's survival. I'll see you in the next one.